earlier today we heard, just to remind you, this conference is kind of segmented into 3 parts based on different types of assessment that are used. Earlier we heard about self-reports and ways to modify self-reports to improve their predictive validity. The next session is going to be about using what we're going to call real-world behaviors as measures of non-cognitive skill. So I'm the first speaker in this series. My name is Tim Kautz. I graduated last spring from University of Chicago in economics, and about a week and a half ago I started a new position at Mathematica Policy Research as a researcher. And yet on my second week I'm already back at UChicago, which was an interesting feeling. It kind of reminded me of this quote from The Godfather. I don't know if you know it, but one of the mobsters is hoping to leave the mob, and at some point he says, "Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in." So I feel a little bit like that today, but seriously, it's great to be here.
Does that make Jim feel?
I'll leave that up to you to figure out. So today I want to talk about how we might be able to use school administrative data to at least proxy non-cognitive skills. And I should mention that this work is joint with co-author Vladimir Zanoni, who's a research associate at Chapin Hall, which is actually just down the road. And so I recently heard a reporter use this interesting term. They used the term non-cognitive revolution, which on one hand made me kind of excited because it meant that a lot of important work is getting media attention and it's becoming in the popular press. But on the other hand, I thought of it as kind of a strange term to use, largely because educators have known about the importance of non-cognitive skills for a very long time, for centuries. People like Horace Mann were emphasizing the importance of perseverance and hard work in the 1800s. And so that was interesting. But what I think has been going on is there is somewhat of a revolution of another kind, and I think it's more related to measurement than anything else. I think recently these non-cognitive skills we've been talking about have kind of fallen to the wayside, in part because people have this idea that they're very difficult to measure, if not impossible. And what I think this recent research is suggesting is there actually are ways to measure these kinds of skills, and they're very valid. And this kind of research has generated interest from a lot of really important organizations that are now trying to assess these skills at a wide scale. So earlier we heard from Koji about this great initiative launched by the OECD, but that's not the only one. Even school districts in the United States are starting to get excited about measuring these skills. So for example, there's this group of school districts in California that submitted a petition to waive their No Child Left Behind responsibilities, partially in order to include non-cognitive skill assessments into their accountability. Yet, in that waiver, they specified yet to be determined non-cognitive skill measurements. And so that's partly why we're here today, is to figure out what kind of instruments schools could potentially use, or the OECD could potentially use. And today I'm going to talk about one possibility that I think is quite promising, and that is thinking about how we can use data that schools already collect to infer non-cognitive skills. And by that kind of data, I'm talking about things like their grades, their absences, credits earned, and disciplinary infractions. And today I'm going to explore a few different things. First, to what extent do these different kinds of measures predict outcomes that we care about, such as college enrollment, arrest rates, and things like that? Second, can we really think of these as capturing something like non-cognitive skills? And I'm going to present some evidence that suggests that I think we can, and we've already seen some evidence earlier today that I think will play into that. But then there's this separate point, which is, even if we can't think of them as exactly mapping into something like the Big Five, they could still be really useful anyway, and I'll show you some evidence that I think they are, at least for some applications. And along those lines, I'm going to show you how incorporating these other kinds of measures can fundamentally change the results of an evaluation, and sort of what we would infer about the efficacy of an intervention. So my presentation is going to be divided into 2 separate but related sections. Both sections are going to rely on administrative data from Chicago Public Schools. In the first section, I'm going to talk about some of the psychometric properties of this data. How correlated are these different measures? How correlated are they with test scores? And what do the individual measures predict? Then I'm going to talk about sort of how how at least we conceptualized applying a measurement framework to separate them into cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And then the second part of the presentation is going to be showing results from this evaluation. And the specifics of this particular intervention aren't too important, but the message I want to take away is that using these other measures really changes what we inferred about the efficacy of the intervention in multiple ways. And so kind of the counterfactual that I'm going to think about is what would have happened had we only had access to achievement test scores to evaluate this intervention, and how does it change to add all these other measures? So our basic measurement approach is based on 3 facts. The first fact is that while grades, absences, credits earned, and disciplinary infractions are somehow related, they're correlated with test scores, they're far from perfectly correlated, suggesting that they do capture something that's at least not captured by an achievement test score. The second point, and I should actually add John 1994 to this list of citations, is that these kinds of measures are correlated with traditional measures of non-cognitive skills. Some recent work has also showed that achievement tests are, and I'll address that later. But the point is then that if you knew someone's grades, that you might be able to infer something about their underlying non-cognitive skills. And in our particular context, we're thinking of it in a certain way, which is like, basically we have access to their test scores and their grades and all these other measures. We say, well, in our definition of non-cognitive, someone who has like a pretty low test score but has good grades must be compensating for that difference in some way. Maybe they're very persistent, they show up to class. Maybe they work well on team projects or whatever it is, but that other thing is how we're going to kind of think about non-cognitive skills in this context. And then the final point is that regardless of how you think of them, these measures are highly predictive of later life outcomes. And this isn't just in our work. Actually, earlier work has shown that these measures, such as credits earned, are really predictive of things like high school graduation. And this is work that's coming out of the CCSR, which is just also down the street studying Chicago public schools. And let me just give you a sense of that, because when I first saw this, it kind of blew me away. This is taken from our particular study, but it's very consistent with what what CCSR found. So what is this graph showing? It's showing the R squared of a group of measures taken in 9th grade from the administrative data in terms of how they predict high school graduation within 5 years. And this is for one cohort within Chicago public schools. And the first bar, this Explore test, is an achievement test that's based on the ACT and is administered in 9th grade, and it has very similar properties to ACT. Yet it's only predicting about 11% of the variance in who eventually graduates. And right now, at least in the US, this is one of our main ways of judging whether schools are effective and whether students are learning what they need to know. Yet when you look at this other set of measures, they're really, really predictive. GPA is about 3 times as predictive as this Explore test. Credits are 2. And even absences are about twice as predictive. These are 9th grade absences. And one question I always get, so let me just preempt it, is, well, some of these measures are sort of mechanically related to graduating from high school. So graduating from high school is a direct function of the number of credits you earn, actually. And we were worried about this problem too. And so what we did to attempt to kind of address that is we looked at a cohort, and we looked at only ones who earned enough credits to move from 9th grade to 10th grade. So somehow they were on track to finish. And even then, they were still very predictive.
Tim, are you taking questions as you go?
Sure, if you.
Since you're back in Chicago.
Yeah.
So, graduating from high school is heterogeneous among lower skill kids. Absences are, more predictive of that. Absences are probably more heterogeneous among lower skill kids. The Explore might be much better at predicting heterogeneity among the higher skill kids. In other words, those other predictors might be useless for predicting heterogeneity among the higher skill kids. So is that worth thinking about?
It's completely worth thinking about, and something we actually did think about and we're really worried about. And so one thing we did is we made a very similar graph using data from the NLS Y79. And we found different magnitudes. Everything was a worse predictor in the NLSY79, but there's similar ordering in which ones were most. So they, even among a sample with a sort of more people who might be at the top of the distribution, they were still predictive, or at least a representative distribution. And so one question, so what I'm going to kind of argue today is that you can think of some of these measures as capturing something like non-cognitive skills. And the way we address it, I'll go into this more detail, is we kind of attempt to remove what we're calling the cognitive component from these measures. In a very simplistic way, you could think of running a regression of grades on, say, your achievement test score, and using that residual as something that we're calling non-cognitive. So it's really kind of non-cognitive in the sense that it is not what is measured by cognitive tests.
Can I just quickly throw in? I totally love that. I'm on record and saying when people saying you need to control IQ when you're looking at the predictive effect of conscientiousness, then I would say, well, who says that IQ comes first?
Yes.
Right? So just if we agree that that's a choice you're making for good reason.
Well, the good reason is you have to make some normalization. And the reason we're doing it, and there's lots of alternatives, and in some sense it doesn't matter in the sense that like either way you do it, you're going to get the same total predictive power when you use all measures, but you have to make some normalization. And we did it this way because we're viewing achievement tests as sort of the baseline for accountability, and then you can interpret these measures as what are added beyond that.
Do you have some, just quickly to tell us that there isn't tremendous variability day by day in the score of the same person taking the same test, cognitive test? I mean, couldn't it be that you took the temperature on a bad day?
Well, that's a good question, but I'll show you some slides later showing that the 9th grade test explains 80% of the variance of a test taken in 11th grade. So, and what I'm also going to argue today is something I was kind of previewing at lunch, which is, at least for certain contexts, especially the intervention literature, it almost doesn't matter if we call this non-cognitive. People hate that term. Probably things like grades capture, the remaining part of grades still capture something that's in your head, or even a skill, in the sense that if your goal is to predict outcomes, say from an intervention, it almost doesn't matter how you classify them as long as the intervention has an effect. Well, we'll talk about that. Let's get there, but I think there's still some use even if you don't think of it as a skill. Although I think there are cases where it does change how you interpret the results. So. And the next point is that using these measures can make a really big difference in how you think about interventions. And I'm going to use this example of an evaluation that we conducted relating to a program called One Goal. And One Goal is a program that was started in Chicago Public Schools and was designed to help kids enroll and persist in college at higher rates. And a big part of that program, they were trying to teach non-cognitive skills that would be useful for those kind of tasks. And what we found in this evaluation, well, one challenge in evaluating is we didn't have an experiment. So we're trying to think of other ways to control for differences in motivation before they entered the program. That way we could find a similar class of students who participated in the program. And we also used a natural experiment. The main point of this isn't to go through the details of the evaluation, except to say, basically, through lots of different methods, we found that the program seemed to be increasing college enrollment by about 10 to 20 percentage points. But what was interesting is that one of our main concern was about selection. And if we had our basic method of controlling for selection was finding students who participated in the program and comparing their outcomes to other sort of observationally equivalent students, a form of matching. And what we found is that if we had just matched based on their test scores, we would have really overestimated the efficacy of this program, because they really were picking students with about average test scores, but we're doing higher in these other categories, like get better grades, more likely to show up to school. And for example, we estimate about a 10 to 15 percentage point effect on high school graduation if we only control for test scores. As soon as we added the non-cognitive measure to that comparison, there was zero effect on high school graduation. So it made a huge difference in that regard. The other way that it made a difference is that the program, at least as we estimated it, had very little effect on achievement test scores after the program. Yet, it still was increasing college enrollment, and on some of these other things like grades and absences, it improved their measures. And so if we had been doing a short run evaluation, just looking at test scores, we probably would have dismissed this program as ineffective. But if we had done a short run evaluation using some of these non-cognitive measures, we might have said, oh, it actually looks a little bit more promising. Okay. And then the main point is that non-cognitive skills, or something like them, can be measured readily using data that schools already collect. So as we're thinking about measuring non-cognitive skills in a wider scale, this would be at least a very easy first stepping stone for schools to start using more of their administrative data. But I think they probably don't capture all of the important non-cognitive skills, so still at some point may want to expand that. All right, so I'm going to proceed as follows. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the data set, then talk about some of the psychometrics and show some of the results of this case study. So we assembled a large data set to conduct this evaluation, and it came from a lot of different sources, including Chicago Public Schools, Chicago Police Department, the National Student Clearinghouse, and the American Community Survey. And each of these told us something different about the kids' indicators in high school and also after high school. And the other good thing is we had a lot of observations. So we had over 200,000 different students from the time that we could follow them to afterwards. So we had a lot of potential comparison groups for our evaluation. Importantly, it includes detailed records of their absences, GPA, achievement test scores, credits earned, and some other demographics, both before they were in the program and after they had been in the program for several years. So basically, the main outcomes we can look at are things like arrest rates, high school progression, and college enrollment. So today, when I use the term non-cognitive measures, it got cumbersome to always say grades, credits earned, absences, and disciplinary reports. When I refer to non-cognitive measures, that's what I mean, is all those things that are not test scores that we're looking at. And the first point I want to make is that these are correlated with test scores, but they're not perfectly correlated. So this figure is showing a correlation matrix between the subcomponents of this Explore test, achievement test taken in 9th grade, and then GPA in different semesters, and then credits and absences in discipline. And what you'll notice is that, well, the Explore measures are highly correlated among each other, and they're relatively correlated with GPA. But when you start looking at things like discipline or absences, they're much less correlated. But things like GPA are more highly correlated with absences, say, than absences are correlated with test scores. So immediately, this suggests that each of these measures is picking up on different things, possibly in different amounts. The other point, this is the Fuller table of the predictive validities that I drew from before, is that different measures are good at predicting different things. And so this table is showing how 9th grade measures taken at the top predict the outcomes in the columns. And so this was the result I was previewing earlier, which is if you look at how the Explore test predicts the ACT, this is 9th grade to 11th grade, it predicts about 78% of the variation, which is fairly high. Then when you look at something like high school graduation, not as much. And GPA and credits are relatively better. When you take a look at things like enrolling in college within 6 years, well, the Explore test is relatively more predictive, but GPA is still even more predictive. And it differs based on these measures. But this is all to say that for a lot of outcomes that we care about, these measures are quite predictive. Now I want to switch gears and talk about how the measurement approach that we actually apply in order to distill these measures into something we can think of as being cognitive and non-cognitive. And as Oliver John mentioned earlier, there's some arbitrariness to this. And I want to be very upfront about how that worked. The first, and this probably earlier we were talking about at lunch how it would be nice to have theories to explain these different measures and what they predict. What I'm about to show you is completely atheoretical, except for that kind of diagram that Jim showed earlier, that basically we can think of any of these measures as a task that could depend on parts of the situation or characteristics of people. Other than that, there's not a lot of guiding theory that we could apply, at least. So our first step was to to basically estimate. Our assumption was there might be some lower dimensional set of measures that explained this high dimensional vector of measures that we had, or latent variables that explained it. And we did some methods to basically determine that it could be explained pretty well by 2 latent variables.
So this is after you call out the intelligence measures, then you still have 2 factors left.
Sorry, that I should rephrase. That's including the intelligence measures. Okay. Then the next step that came to mind was this figure, which is basically highlighting the identification problems associated with measuring things in general. This is what I was talking about before. We conceptualized this, that each of these measures that we had, including test scores, was performance on some task. And we thought, okay, well, task performance could depend partly on incentives and some other cognitive skills. We really wanted to try to isolate non-cognitive skills. And so we have some measures of aspects of the situation that we thought could influence this task performance. So they weren't great, but for some things like absences, we thought maybe the distance they lived from school would be a factor in whether they showed up on time. It turned out not to have that much predictive power, but it was our effort to standardize for that. But what gets really complicated, and this was the issue that came up earlier, is say we have a measure like test scores and a measure like grades. We kind of think test scores are cognitive skill, and we kind of think grades are non-cognitive skill. Or, the other evidence suggested that they might load highly on that. Yet, there's some correlation between test scores and grades. And the question is, what do you do with that correlation? And I think there's at least 3 sensible approaches to dealing with this, probably more. One approach is to assume that part of grades actually just depends on whatever we're calling cognitive skill. So you can imagine that part of getting good grades is taking test scores. If you're equating cognitive skill and test scores, then you could say, okay, well, grades actually just partly depends on test scores. However, the other option is that, achievement tests might actually depend on non-cognitive skills. How much time you study, how much you're willing to put in time to learn new words, whatever. So actually, this correlation might be explained because grades are a very good measure of non-cognitive skills, and test scores also depend on that. The final possibility is you could think, well, actually, grades and test scores are measuring 2 very distinct concepts, and it just happens that biologically or whatever, they're correlated. So the different tasks don't depend on both cognitive and non-cognitive skill, yet in our population, we're seeing a correlation because they just happen to be correlated, say, biologically or something. To my knowledge, this is where I would love a theory to tell us which of these options to pick, but I couldn't think of one. And in order to estimate anything interpretable, basically, we had to make some normalization. So what we assumed is that test scores were measured completely cognitive skill, and the residual was non-cognitive skill. And I think in this context, it yielded something that was pretty interpretable. This is the formal measurement model. It's basically just putting equations to that picture I showed you earlier. And I only have 5 minutes left, so I better hurry up. Now, just to convince you that this method didn't do something completely crazy, we looked at how these extracted measures of cognitive and non-cognitive skill predicted the kinds of outcomes we were looking at earlier. And what we found, say, for graduating high school is that the cognitive skill had about the same predictive power as the test score that we used, the average test score. And non-cognitive skill was basically, if you look at the total variance predicted by both, it's pretty similar to what we get when we just include all measures in a regression. And the non-cognitive skill and cognitive skill add up perfectly to reach that total. So this, again, I think you can basically think of this non-cognitive skill as what you get by adding all these other measures. But it changes. So for example, with college enrollment, earlier we saw that grades and test scores were actually similar predictors. Here we're getting that cognitive skill is relatively better. And that's exactly because we're assuming that any correlation between the grades and the test scores is due to a cognitive component. So we're kind of giving non-cognitive skills the short end, if anything. Now I want to show you how this kind of idea changed our evaluation. And what I really want to think, we did a lot of different things in the evaluation sensitivity checks. What I'm going to say is let's just pretend for a moment that the treatment effects that we estimate really are true causal effects of the program. How would those have changed depending on which measures we used? I'm really running low on time. The main takeaways about the program itself are that it tried to boost non-cognitive skills, but based on the way it was designed, there was some concern that it might recruit students with higher non-cognitive skills. And because we didn't have an experiment, we had to find out ways to deal with that. We used several different approaches. One was basically a natural experiment, but what I'm going to say is the main approach is we used some form of matching to basically match people who participated in the program with observationally equivalent students based on their skills and demographics before they started the program and see how their outcomes were different later. So these are the main results for males, and basically, this graph is showing you the estimated effect on the probability of not being arrested. It's kind of the reverse of being arrested. Graduating high school, enrolling in college, and completing 2 years of college. And basically, we find not a big effect almost no effect on graduation from high school, small effect on arrests, but a very large effect on enrolling in college. And similarly, for females, very little effect on arrests or graduating from high school, but a large effect of enrolling in college. We did lots of different sensitivity analyses, different assumptions. But now I'm going to switch to thinking about what would have changed had we not had measures of non-cognitive skills to match on. And the first thing I want to talk about is how the program recruited students with higher non-cognitive skills and cognitive skills. So this graph is showing the distribution of the cognitive skills for people who didn't participate in the program in blue and those who did in red. There's some difference, but it's about a 2 to 3 percentile difference in, say, a national distribution. So it's economically not a big deal. Same with females. When we actually look at their non-cognitive skill measures, you can see that there's a big shift in the distribution between participants and non-participants, which suggested that this program really is going after kids who might be more motivated. So the next exercise was to say, how much difference does this make? The first bar is showing what would happen if we just controlled for their demographics, things like race. The second is showing the effect if we had just controlled for demographics plus cognitive skill. And the final bar is showing if we additionally control for non-cognitive skill. So had we not had a good measure of non-cognitive skill, or whatever this is picking up on, we would have estimated about a 15 percentage point boost in high school graduation as soon as we control for non-cognitive 0. So it played a huge role, fundamental role in the matching component of our evaluation. The other question was basically, what if we had just used test scores as our only outcome? What would have happened? And what we would have found is actually an effect for males. So this first bar is showing. And we would have found no significant effect for females. And these are not big differences in some meaningful way. We do find, but when we think about non-cognitive skills, we did find that the program, based on this measurement system, improved non-cognitive skills for men and had a large improvement for females. And this is a graph showing the treatment effect decomposed into a component due to cognitive skill and non-cognitive skill in the bright blue. And what you'll see is that the non-cognitive skills add a substantial amount of, explain a fair amount of the treatment effect. Neither does a perfect job for males, and for females, they explain a larger effect. So basically, if we hadn't had these measures, we would have assumed the program did nothing for females, even though it had a large effect on enrollment. So I'm getting the cue to wrap up. As the moderator, I feel particularly obliged to follow it. So I just want to say that I think this study basically showed that these measures are a useful way to, at the very least, track students. You may not think that they fully capture something like a skill in the traditional sense, yet they still add a lot to evaluations. And I think one place where that really has a substantive difference is, are these changes long-lasting? So we found that they were associated with improvements in outcomes, but the question is, did these students continue to have higher non-cognitive skills, say, in 10 years, or whether this was just some, effective incentives of the program that caused them to have higher grades temporarily? And I think that would change if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, like how much you would put, like what value you would put on those increases in skills. I think there's a lot of questions for future work related to this. Things like, did we control for the correct situations involved in measuring them? What other incentives would have mattered? And how do these relate to some of the other kinds of measures we talked about today? Thank you very much. Yes, Deborah.
So I really like this. I'm not, I guess I'm going to be a bit provocative and introduce the causality term. I struggle a bit to know whether I think of them as skills for all kinds of reasons, right? I mean, take attendance, for example. That has as much to do with parental behaviors as it does with the kid.
Turns out that we're deaf over here. We're
Okay.
old and deaf.
Okay.
You need to close the door because we have trouble hearing you.
So I'm having trouble necessarily thinking them of skills, but I don't actually think I care about that. I'm quite persuaded by the fact that they're predictive. And again, I spend a lot of time talking to policymakers, and one of the things I worry about is that they tend to hear frequently from academics that we need to establish causality. Mostly what policymakers are doing is not sitting around thinking about complex interventions that are going to promote life outcomes 20 years from now. Mostly what they're doing on a day-to-day basis is allocating pretty scarce resources. So if you can hand them something that's predictive, that's pretty good. And if what you're saying is that we can start thinking about these things as, being outcomes that can be influenced, whether you want to call them skills and I want to think it's about parental behavior or whatever, it doesn't really matter if we start to get a handle on what actually works.
Well, just a quick response. So I agree with that. And I think, to me, the step going from, I think there's, I didn't, they're named skills because I think there's some evidence suggesting they might reflect skills. But I think that your criticism of this is also true of kind of any of the measures we've talked about today that don't standardize for all possible situations that were given. So even something like a self-report of conscientiousness, maybe kids aren't hardworking because of their parents, for example, and it's not some underlying trait. So I think that criticism kind of applies. I would argue that it at least applies more broadly than this. But I think your other point I completely agree with, which is in a lot of ways, for some purposes, it doesn't matter in some sense. Yep.
So speaking of the allocation of resources, OECD is about to allocate a lot of resources to measuring skills over time across the world. And I guess your talk makes me wonder whether they should allocate a lot fewer resources to measuring non-cognitive skills and just use administrative data. Would you say if they had a choice between spending $150 million developing and administering new measures and spending 1.7 gathering data that already exists, what would you say they should do?
That's a tough question to answer. But one concern I have with this is that this works pretty well in CPS and even in the US, where there's certain federal absences. There's certain federal regulations that stipulate how you count absences in school, and they try to standardize it across states. That may not be true between here and Japan, for example. So I would worry about that a little bit. But I think, one study that I would love to do is in Chicago public schools, say, administer the self-reports, some of the task-based measures that we talked about today, and compare what they're measuring to administrative data. And then we could actually do a cost-benefit analysis where we say, per R squared that we're buying, which one is sort of most effective.
I have a very quick response. I'm looking at Angela Duckworth. I'm glad that you're here finally. But you pulled off if you've done a couple of papers on this. You pulled off some other things that are hard to get. Like participation in sports activities, in teams, and so on. So typically, what you get from the records of the institution is what you used to call externalizing behavior, right? Our developmental hat put on there. And so those are the kids that make trouble for the school. a lot of other things, like, that we care about related to openness, for example, your artistic performances are not going to be easily pulled from those admin records. So you're getting a particular class of important but not comprehensive attributes.
So Tim said I'm allowed to say one thing. Okay, wait. Also, I want to say I'm sorry I'm late, but that wasn't my one thing. That I think if you want to change kids' trajectories, you can't just say that there's this latent factor of non-cognitive skills that is very predictive of their long-term outcomes. It doesn't tell you at all what to do. The Big Five is one step forward, and of course it's only the first step. But until you know what it is in that larger non-cognitive factor that is the problem, you really haven't gotten started. So I think that's another reason that coaches should spend $150 million.
Well, I have one question and follow up with that, actually very related to your work. So I was at another sort of gathering on measurement, and so they're comparing two different interventions. I mentioned this at lunch, but one of them was designed to improve grit, and they tested whether it improved grit. And there was another one that wasn't designed at all to improve grit, and they still tested whether it did. And the one that was specifically designed to improve grit, maybe they didn't do it correctly or whatever, did not have a big effect, whereas the other one did. So I think like thinking that we know what's causing what in the school system or educational programming based on which measures it's affecting can be in cases misleading. So I think at some level there's still going to be the same problem, that it's moving some latent factor that we don't fully understand. That's just my thought.
If we don't understand this latent factor, policy cannot be used. Right? Suppose I find it cannot just be the predictive power. Suppose I find that absences explain a lot of your graduation outcome, but I don't think anybody of us would agree. Okay, so now we go really very hard and we try to reduce absences, because
I agree.
with the police intervention, we all agree that it would be completely would be very likely counterproductive, and we have an intuition of why that is. Right? So, with that, only predictive power is not going to be enough. I mean, it might take us to very absurd conclusions, and some politicians might get to absurd conclusions.
No, but I agree with that. But I guess the question is, how would you devise a measurement system that you would feel comfortable saying that if you shift this, it's really going to result in some other outcome? I think that whether it's absences or grit scale or whatever, I think you might run into something similar, I guess, unless you have some thought on that. Yeah.
You do have, I presume, a richer record than just the GPA. So, I mean, the theory, a theory of what's different between a grade and a test in math is kind of an interesting thing. They probably the top grade meant what it meant. It's just they taught the wrong math for the test or something. Yeah. Whereas in another field, it really would be about, this person's social and agreeable, and so if you have you been able to break up which bits of the grade, or even come up with a theory of which bits of the grade are much more social and something else than simply they were taught and didn't?
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think it would be fascinating. Like earlier, we were talking about splitting these aggregates up into sub-aggregates and investigating it. But I guess the question is, what theory? I mean, there's some intuition that we have that these things should be connected. But I would say the real test is whether they can be changed by a particular intervention. Like that may.
But you have some prior thoughts. I mean, you probably have quite a lot.
I'm not scheduled to talk, but yeah, I can tell you about my theory on break.
Yeah.
Go ahead, tell us.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so
we're supposed to have a discussion.
Yeah, this is
my opinion. Yeah.
So sorry, but so before I was a psychologist, I was a teacher, and I would administer these standardized tests, and I would peek into the booklet and think, oh shit, I definitely did not teach them that.
Yeah.
And then I would think, okay, well, maybe we'll figure it out. Box plot, how hard could it be to figure out on the day of the test, just like rifling through the pages. My theory is that the disparity between grades and test scores, in other words, the variance that they don't share, is primarily effort, which I would say then it's like, well, why are some kids trying harder? Big Five conscientiousness and self-control, which have more in common than they don't have in common. And I think that we have data. So what's great about a study like this is it tells you what you can do without administering other measures. But when you do go to the expense of administering other measures, like multi-method batteries of self-control, including delayed gratification tasks and parent and teacher and self-report questionnaires, you can actually identify some things much more precisely, and we find that you can explain a lot of that non-shared variance through self-control. That's my theory.
Do you think there would actually be, for example, a difference if you actually measured the time that they took doing the exercises? In fact, it would turn out they were inputting more time, and that was...
I think they would, and let me just say that my answer is incomplete. I think that when a kid does well on their grades and they have shitty test scores, I think they must be a kid who tries really hard, turns in all their homework. And by the way, we actually surveyed large groups of middle school and high school teachers, and they did what I never did, which is they actually just give kids higher grades for trying harder. I never did. I was like, you know, your grades are great, and I'll hug you, but like, I won't change your grade. But most teachers that we interviewed just literally changed the grade because the kid was a hard worker. So I think grades really reflect that disparity in effort. And I'll just, my answer was incomplete because those kids who open up the standardized test booklet and were never taught something and therefore had no opportunity to apply effort to a problem, I think it is actually fluid intelligence or IQ that I think test scores are highly weighted toward that because the content and the format are relatively speaking novel to them, and that's almost the definition of an IQ test. So I think things pull apart. Self-control loads highly on grades, and IQ loads highly on test scores, and they obviously all share a lot, but if you want to ask what's different about them, I think that's what it is. And I think these directions are hugely promising. I would love to pursue all of it.
Steve, we'll take, so I'm trying to self-moderate myself. We'll take one more question from you, Steve, and then we'll introduce you as the next speakers.
I wanted to know about the informational content of trajectories in the following sense. That if there are these latent variables of interest, such as conscientiousness, I would think a trajectory which goes like this is informative versus one that's kind of erratic for a while and goes up. Have you thought about some sort of approaches to uncovering the latent variables that it really takes the dynamics seriously?
No, I mean, I think I completely agree with the point. It's something we thought about for this project. We didn't implement anything. But the one thing that came to mind was some of Bert Singer's work, which has shown they basically take time series data and create different, using sort of applying this form of logic called abduction, trying to figure out different sort of patterns in time series things and how those change the story about something. And I think that would be a really good approach, is to try to classify them. So, there's some kid who's going down in conscientiousness and there's someone who's going up. Maybe you have lots of someone's really sporadic, and see how those predict things. I would love to do that. I think that's a really good point.